It was a cold, rainy November night when I boarded the last train out of Chicago. The time was just past midnight, and the platform was eerily quiet. I had been visiting a friend for the weekend, but now it was time to return home, back to Milwaukee. I've always liked trains. There's something peaceful about watching the world pass by outside the window. But on this night, everything felt different. The train was nearly empty when I stepped inside, which was strange. Normally, the last train would still have a few people trying to get home late, but tonight, it felt like I was the only passenger. I found a seat near the back of the carriage and settled in, pulling my jacket tight around me. The train's doors closed with a soft hiss, and we started moving. As we moved through the dark forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around the carriage, but I was alone. The dim overhead lights flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the walls. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. About 30 minutes into the ride, something strange happened. I was staring out the window at the dark forest when I noticed a reflection in the glass. A man was sitting in the seat directly behind me. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone board the train, and I was sure I had been alone this whole time. My mind raced. How could he have gotten there without me noticing? Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me, but when I looked, the seat was empty. Confused, I peeked back at the window. There he was again. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. His mouth hung open slightly, as if he was trying to speak but couldn't. I whipped my head back to the seat, but again, it was empty. My hands started to tremble. I didn't understand what was happening. Was I imagining this? Was I just overtired? I tried to calm myself down, but I couldn't stop looking at the window. Every time I glanced at it, the man was there, sitting motionless, watching me. I decided to move to a different carriage. Grabbing my bag, I hurried through the door to the next coach. This one was just as empty, but at least I didn't see anyone in the reflection here. I found a seat closer to the front and sat down, trying to shake the feeling of fear that had settled over me. The train rattled on, the sound of the tracks now the only thing I could hear. But then, out of the silence, came another sound. It started as a low whisper, almost too quiet to notice. I tried to hear, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the seat behind me again. My throat went dry. There was no one else in this coach. I had checked. Gathering all my courage, I stood up and turned around. The seat was empty, but the whispering continued. I started to back away, moving toward the door. But as I did, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was all around me, as if the air in the train was alive with it. Suddenly, the train screeched to a stop. I nearly fell over from the force of it. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I looked out the window, expecting to see a station, but we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings, no lights, nothing but the dark forest and the rain. The doors of the carriage opened with a loud creak. I stared at them, too terrified to move, and then I saw it. A figure stepped through the door, tall, dressed in black, with a pale, expressionless face. It moved slowly, deliberately. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I panicked. My feet felt frozen to the ground, but I forced myself to move. I bolted toward the back of the carriage, hoping to get as far away from the figure as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always right behind me. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, closing in on me with every step. I reached the end of the carriage, gasping for breath. There was nowhere else to go. The figure stood just a few feet away now, staring at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was sure this was the end. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for whatever was about to happen, but nothing did. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The train had started moving again, as though nothing had happened. I collapsed into the nearest seat, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get off this train. Finally, after what felt like hours, we pulled into a station. I grabbed my bag and sprinted off the train without looking back. The platform was empty, but I didn't care. I just needed to be off that train. As I stood on the platform, trying to catch my breath, I looked back at the train. Through the rain-soaked windows, I saw the pale figure standing inside, watching me. The doors closed and the train slowly pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night. I've never told anyone about it, and I've never taken a train since. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that figure, and I wonder if it's still out there, riding the midnight trains, looking for someone else to watch. It was a cold winter night when I had to take an overnight train journey for work. The train, a rickety old thing, wasn't known for comfort, but it was the only option. The station was eerily quiet when I arrived. The usual hustle of passengers, vendors shouting for tea, and the noise of trains pulling in and out was absent. A thick fog had settled in, muting every sound around me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just a late-night trip, after all. I boarded the train and found my compartment. It was surprisingly empty, apart from an old man sitting by the window. He had his coat pulled tightly around him, and a hat covering most of his face. We didn't speak, but I felt his presence weighing heavily on me. His stillness was unsettling. As the train began to move, I decided to close my eyes and try to sleep. The gentle rocking of the train usually lulled me to sleep, but tonight was different. The atmosphere was oppressive. There was a strange smell in the air, like old, musty fabric and damp wood. I shifted in my seat and looked over at the old man. He hadn't moved an inch, still staring out the window. After what felt like hours, the train slowed down at a station. I peeked outside, but it didn't look like any station I'd seen before. The sign was faded, the lights were flickering, and not a single soul was in sight. I leaned over to the window, trying to read the station name, but it was too worn to read. The train doors opened, and that's when I saw him. A tall, thin figure stepped onto the platform. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes, there was something wrong with them. They were wide open, staring straight ahead without blinking, yet they felt like they were looking right at me. I wanted to get off the train and run, but my legs were frozen. The man boarded my compartment. The old man next to me still hadn't moved or reacted. It was as if he didn't even notice the new passenger, but I did. The man walked slowly, deliberately towards me. My heart raced as he took the seat directly across from me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring. I tried to speak, to ask him where he was going, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel the temperature in the compartment drop as if the air around him was cold, deathly cold. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time felt strange. The sound of the train clacking on the tracks was the only thing keeping me grounded. I glanced over at the old man again, hoping for some comfort, but he was gone. Just like that. His seat was empty, and the fog from outside seemed to seep into the compartment. The strange passenger never moved, never blinked. His eyes were fixed on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. Suddenly, the train began to slow down. We were approaching another station, but this one wasn't on the map. The name was unfamiliar, and the platform was deserted, just like before. My body tensed as the train came to a halt and the door opened. The pale man stood up, his movements unnaturally stiff. He walked towards the door, but paused right in front of me. He leaned in, and for the first time he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was a low whisper, like wind through a crack in the window. Before I could respond, he stepped off the train and disappeared into the fog. I was alone now, completely alone. The old man never returned. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and confusion. I barely slept, too scared to close my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. When the train finally pulled to my destination the next morning, I hurried off, my heart still racing. I approached the station master, desperate to understand what had happened. I asked him about the strange man and the stations we'd stopped at during the night. His face went pale when I described the events. "Those stations haven't been in use for over 50 years, he said, his voice shaky. "There was a terrible accident on that line. A train derailed in the fog and all the passengers, they didn't make it." My blood ran cold. The pale man's words echoed in my head. "You shouldn't be here." After that night, I tried to forget, but something wouldn't let me. A few weeks later, I found myself researching the train line, looking up old news articles about the accident the station master had mentioned. There it was, clear as day. A train derailed on a foggy winter night 50 years ago. All passengers were declared dead, but what struck me was the description of the crash. The article mentioned an old man and a tall, pale passenger. They were among the last people seen boarding the train that night before the crash. My heart stopped when I saw a blurry photo included in the article. There, sitting by the window, was the old man from my compartment, and next to him, unmistakably, was the pale man who had stared at me. I couldn't believe it. The man in the picture was wearing the same clothes with the same haunting expression. I never took that route again, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that the train I boarded that night wasn't meant for the living. I had always been a train enthusiast, fascinated by the hum of wheels on the track. So, when my friend Alex suggested a late-night train ride to a small, remote town, I jumped at the opportunity. We boarded the last carriage, excited for the quiet and peaceful journey. There were only a few passengers scattered around. The lights flickered occasionally, but that seemed normal for an old train like this. As the train picked up speed, something strange happened. The carriage we were in started to feel colder, unnaturally cold. I peeked around, and that's when I noticed it. There were no shadows. Despite the dim lights overhead, the passengers, the seats, the walls, everything had an eerie glow, as if the light wasn't really touching them. Alex whispered, "Do you feel that? Something's off." I nodded. Suddenly, the train jolted violently, almost throwing us out of our seats. The lights went out completely for a few seconds before flickering back on. In the brief darkness, I had the distinct sensation that we weren't alone. But as soon as the lights returned, the passengers were still in their seats, motionless. Only something was wrong. The man across from us, who had been reading a newspaper, no longer had a face. His face was replaced by a smooth, pale surface. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but Alex saw it too. "Let's move to another car," Alex whispered, his voice shaking. We stood up, but the door to the next carriage wouldn't open. I yanked on it, panicking now, as I felt the air grow even colder. The passengers remained still, their blank faces now turned toward us, their eyes gone, their mouths sealed shut. It was as if they were mannequins. No, not mannequins, something worse. A low hum started to fill the air, and the train picked up speed. We tried to get the conductor's attention by banging on the windows of the locked door, but no one came. The humming grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, a woman stood up from her seat. Her face was like the others, blank and featureless, but she was holding something in her hand. A small, rusted key. She walked toward us, her movements slow and deliberate. Without thinking, I snatched the key from her cold hand and rushed to the locked door. The key fit. I turned it, praying it would work. The door swung open with a screech, and we stumbled into the next carriage. But as soon as we crossed over, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. This carriage was empty, completely empty, but it wasn't the kind of emptiness you'd expect. It was wrong, like a void. The windows showed nothing but blackness. No tracks, no sky, no passing trees, just an endless, suffocating darkness. I could feel it pressing in, trying to pull us in. We ran toward the front of the train, but every door we opened led to the same empty, black void. It was as if the train had broken free from the real world, plunging us into some hellish dimension where time didn't exist. After what felt like hours of running, we finally reached the conductor's cabin. I burst in, hoping to find someone, anyone, who who could stop this madness. But the cabin was empty. No controls, no conductor, just a mirror reflecting our terrified faces. I turned to Alex, who was pale as a ghost. "What do we do now?" He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not getting off this train." Just as the words left his mouth, the train began to slow. The screeching brakes echoed through the empty carriage. For a brief moment, I thought we had reached a station. My heart filled with hope. But when the doors opened, what I saw left me frozen in place. It wasn't a station. Outside, there was nothing but fog, thick, dense fog that seemed to swirl unnaturally. The few passengers who had been sitting with us earlier slowly stood up. They walked toward the open doors. Without a word, they stepped off the train into the fog and disappeared. I turned to Alex and said, "We have to get off." "Into that?" he replied, his eyes wide with terror. "We don't know what's out there." But staying on the train didn't seem any safer. I took a deep breath and grabbed Alex's arm. "We can't stay here. This train isn't taking us anywhere good." Reluctantly, Alex nodded. Together, we stepped off the train into the swirling fog. The cold hit me like a punch, and within seconds I couldn't see the train, the platform, nothing. It was as if the world had vanished, leaving us alone in the mist. We stumbled through the fog, calling out, but there was no answer, no sign of life. Just endless, suffocating silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow. At first, I thought it was one of the passengers, but as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and glowing eyes that pierced through the fog. It moved toward us slowly, deliberately. "We need to go. Now!" I screamed, pulling Alex into a run. We sprinted through the fog, the shadow following us, its heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. But no matter how fast we ran, the fog never ended. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the shadow running toward us. Just when I thought it would reach us, there was a flash of light, blinding us, and suddenly, the fog evaporated, and we found ourselves standing on a train platform, the old station from earlier that night. The train was gone. The fog was gone. But something wasn't right. The platform was empty. No people, no sounds. The world around us seemed frozen in time. And as I looked at Alex, had we ever really left the train? Or were we still trapped, caught between this world and whatever darkness was out there waiting for us? We never took a train again. To this day, I don't know where that train was taking us, or what would have happened if we'd stayed. But sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in, I hear the sound of a train whistle in the distance, and I wonder if it's still out there, searching for new passengers. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these true, terrifying stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss scary stories that will keep you up at night.